The living room lights were turned low, but the chandelier over the oak coffee table threw hard white across the polished wood, as if the whole evening needed a spotlight. Cufflinks glinted. Ice settled in glasses and cracked like tiny bones. I stood in the doorway long enough for everyone to look up, then sat where my father pointed an armless chair by the far lamp angled toward no one. Lily kept her eyes on the fireplace. James rested his palm on the small of her back in a gesture meant for an audience. My mother folded her hands so tightly the knuckles blanched. The only sound for a long second was the hum of the air vent and the faint clink of my father's wedding ring against his tumbler. "Now that everyone is here," my father said, "not meeting my eyes, we can settle final arrangements." They discussed bands and flowers, limousines, and seating charts. I watched lips move, watched notes taken, watched the tall man with steel gray hair. James's father nod at numbers the way a judge nods after a plea. Someone asked about the photography schedule. Someone else dictated who would stand where for portraits. I wasn't in any of the lists. When the last vendor payment was checked off, my father cleared his throat and placed both hands on his knees like he was about to rise, then stayed seated. "Amy," he said, finally looking, "there's something we need to discuss with you. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, hit that like button and share this story with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss what happens next. To understand why that night changed everything you need to know, how ordinary love can become conditional without anyone saying the words out loud. I grew up 7 years ahead of Lily, old enough to remember carrying her upstairs when she fell asleep in the car, old enough to braid her hair, while the coffee maker sputtered in the kitchen. My father ran a small accounting firm on Main Street. My mother managed a boutique near the courthouse, the kind of people who waved to neighbors and kept the lawn between the sidewalk lines. When both of them worked late, I learned to hum the tunes my mother used to hush a baby, learned which blanket quieted the fussy hour, learned where the thermometer lived, and how to read it. Responsibility seeped into me the way heat seeps into a pan. The neighborhood knew me as steady, the girl who returned library books on time and organized bake sale cash boxes with neat rubber bands. Later, when I babysat for the cul-de-sac, I brought home small things for Lily: butterfly hair clips, silly socks, the stuffed unicorn she had named long before she owned it. My parents shook their heads as if I was spoiling her, but relief flickered in their smiles. A family runs smoother when someone on the inside volunteers to be the hinge. By high school, our differences hardened. I studied, saved, kept my world in order. Lily lit rooms as she entered them. At the dinner table, my grades were greeted with nods. Her prom date was celebrated with a roast glowing on the table like a trophy. When I earned a partial scholarship to the state university, I received a card. When Lily got into the same school years later, a cake arrived at the house and a new laptop waited in a crisp, white box. I learned to fold happiness smaller so it would fit in the space allowed. Work came easily to me. I liked numbers, their quiet honesty. After school, I moved into a downtown apartment with thin walls and a view of a brick alley, and I loved it anyway, because the lease and the light bill had my name on them. Promotions arrived like rungs on a ladder. When my father's business tightened and my mother hinted at a rough month, I set up a joint account because it seemed like what dependable daughters do. I put money in. Sometimes it went out. Mostly, I was glad to be useful. Then Lily met James. He had the voice of someone who never had to raise it to be heard, and the posture of a man who expected the world to meet him halfway. He drove a car that smelled like new leather and sweetened gasoline, and his mother wore a bracelet that answered every nod of her wrist with a polite ring. My parents loved him the way a thirsty lawn loves rain. And if I asked what his family business actually did, what we call the line where money becomes profit, James smiled like I'd missed the joke and promised to tell me when it's less of a long story. The first time the Kingston family invited us to dinner, the table was set with the kind of silver that remembers other hands. Their house faced west. The sunset poured through glass like honey. I watched my mother soften under compliments about her dress. I watched my father become taller with every mention of new opportunities and future introductions. When the conversation reached the part where Lily's life would be photographed for magazines and holiday cards, I offered a practical question about risk management. "Amy's in finance," my mother said quickly, as if she needed to explain me. "She asks those kinds of questions." Later in the parking lot, Lily laughed it off. "You don't have to analyze everything," she said, tugging my sleeve. "Just be happy for me." I wanted to tell her that asking where the bridge lands isn't an insult to the view, but the wind carried away my voice, and it seemed easier, kinder, to let the night end on a smile. In the months that followed, I found myself seated farther and farther from the center. A college roommate took over the bridal shower. I wasn't asked to be a bridesmaid. I arrived to family planning dinners with 3 days' notice, while other guests had received embossed cards weeks earlier. When James's mother invited me to tea, she stirred her cup as if she needed the sound to think. "Weddings can be complicated for families," she said, eyes pleasant but cool. "To keep the day smooth, perhaps, it's best if you keep a low profile. Avoid being central in photographs." "You're asking me to step back," I said. "Just a little," she answered, and added one more spoonful of sugar. After that, my mother's calls grew shorter. My father's texts landed like directives. Lily's messages slid from affectionate to careful to nothing at all. A coworker sent me a rumor, as if it were a sympathy card. Someone at Lily's gym had heard that I once dated James, that he'd broken up with me for being too controlling. That bitterness made me difficult now. I drove to Lily's apartment with that lie burning a hole where my breath should be, and asked for the truth. She crossed her arms and told me I was making everything about me. When I said I had been nothing but supportive, her eyes flared. "If you can't be 100% happy without those questions," she said, "maybe don't come." That's how the night in the living room arrived, after weeks of polite daylight and closed doors. My father kept the ledger of the evening the way he keeps all ledgers: precise, balanced, bloodless. The Kingstons were present like witnesses. My mother watched her hands. Lily rested inside the circle of James's arm, as if she might disappear without the border. "Amy," my father said again, drawing a breath, as if each word cost him. "This wedding is more than a ceremony. It binds two families. There have been concerns about tension. We've decided the greatest gift you could give your sister is to disappear from our family. Permanently." No one gasped. No one stood. The fireplace hissed softly, eating a log. James's father lifted his glass to his mouth, then set it down again without drinking. I looked at my mother and begged her with my eyes to say it was a misunderstanding. She kept them on the carpet. "Is this what you want?" I asked Lily. I heard my voice from a distance, like a road you once took and can no longer picture. Her fingers tightened on James's sleeve. She didn't look up. The smallest nod was all I got. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because I could feel the floor tilt under us, and I needed my legs to stay good. The room smelled of cologne and the citrus from my mother's cleaner. I stood. My father's shoulders sank with relief, as if he'd finished a chore. I walked down the hallway to my old room where the wallpaper still held faint shadows where boy band posters had once hung. A storage bin took up the corner where my desk used to sit. I opened the closet and found the shoebox that held the little things: my grandmother's earrings, a homecoming ticket, a photo of Lily missing her front teeth and grinning at a cupcake. I put 3 items in my purse. The rest looked like a life, but not one I needed to carry. On the way back down the hall, laughter floated from the living room light, quick the sound people make when they survive discomfort. I set my house key on the entry table where we always dropped mail. It landed with a small, bright ring. There were photographs on the wall, birthdays, diplomas, grandparents with paper hats at New Year's. In almost every one, my hand was on Lily's shoulder. I stepped outside. The porch light hummed. A moth battered itself against the glass. The evening air smelled like wet boxwood and the neighbor's grill cooling down. I walked to my car with my chin level and my steps even the way you carry a glass of water when you don't want it to spill. When the engine woke, the dashboard clock glowed like a watch face in a dark theater. As the car rolled backward, I glanced at the window. 4 silhouettes lifted their glasses, a little toast without me. It is a special kind of quiet when a door closes behind you and nobody calls your name. The sound follows you into the driver's seat, into the open road down the familiar streets where the corners still remember your turns. Every telephone pole and porch swing, every stop sign and cracked sidewalk. Every porch where you once waited for a ride, everything looks the same except you. I turned onto the avenue that leads away from our subdivision. Trees arched over the street in a tunnel of leaves. The last light made them look like stained glass. My hands stayed steady on the wheel. Somewhere between the second and third light, my throat decided to stop. I swallowed. The red at the intersection held me a full minute. I watched the cross traffic move through steady as breathing. The light turned green. I drove on. I didn't go home. Home had turned into a collection of walls and paperwork cross-referenced with a list of favors. I kept moving until the skyline rose like a row of old teeth and a hotel sign blinked vacancy in blue. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and something floral that didn't exist in nature. I handed over my card and received a key card and advice about the elevators. When the room door clicked shut behind me, it sounded like a lid settling. The window looked down on a parking lot where taillights came and went like fireflies. On the desk sat a laminated list of breakfast hours and a ballpoint pen that didn't want to write. I rested my purse where a guest book might go and stood there until standing felt like another decision I could get wrong. I wanted to text my mother. Are you sure I wanted to ask my father softly as if we were back at the kitchen table balancing a checkbook? Do you understand what you've done? I wanted to knock on Lily's door like it was a Saturday morning and we could start over with pancakes. My phone stayed dark, a small, unblinking eye on the table. The air conditioner kicked on. A thin silver of cool crossed the carpet and touched my ankles like river water. Outside, a car door shut. Footsteps. Laughter across the parking lot. The life of strangers rose and fell. Inside, I pulled the curtains until the city shrank to a soft rectangle and listened to the sound of the room breathing. I had been the hinge for so long, I didn't know how to be the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands the way my mother had, the way women do when there is nothing else to hold except themselves. My purse felt heavy against my hip earrings, a photo, a key that no longer belonged anywhere. The urge to explain myself to people who had already rendered their verdict passed through me like a cold front. A minute later, it passed again. I took one breath, then another, then a third, the way you do when someone tells you to calm down and you realize you might actually need to. Outside the window, a siren threaded the night and faded. The ice in the hotel's hallway machine dropped a fresh load with a clatter. Somewhere on my floor, a television chuckled at a laugh track I couldn't hear the jokes for. I reached for my phone. I didn't dial. My thumb hovered, then lowered. I placed it back on the desk screen, down this time. In the glass of the window, I could see my reflection, the outline of a woman sitting very still, dressed for a family dinner. She had been asked to leave without anyone saying the word leave. The room pulsed with the kind of quiet that asks you a question you don't want to answer yet. And that's where the night held me between the door that had closed and the first decision that would open another one. The night air outside the hotel had been cool and sharp, but by morning, the room felt heavy and stale. I sat at the edge of the bed, watching the muted light push through the curtains. It was the kind of dawn that made everything look flat and uncertain. My phone lay face down on the desk, silent since the night before. No missed calls, no messages, only the echo of what my father had said still circling in my head like a bird that wouldn't land. I didn't cry, not yet. There was too much shock left in me for tears. I moved through the next few hours like someone following instructions from a manual. Shower dress shoes, purse. I left the room key on the nightstand, checked out, and drove to a diner a few blocks away. The waitress called me Han and poured coffee without asking if I wanted it. That small kindness nearly undid me. I sat there a long time stirring cream into my cup, just to watch the white swirl disappear. By noon, I was back in motion. It felt safer that way. I called my office and asked for 2 weeks off, citing a family emergency. Then I called my real estate agent, a steady woman named Carla, who had sold me my first apartment. I told her I wanted to list it immediately. She hesitated, asking if something had happened. I told her I just needed a clean slate. By mid-afternoon, she had buyers interested cash offers on the table if I was willing to close fast. I said yes. The less time I spent standing still, the better. My next stop was my lawyer's office. The receptionist recognized me and offered the usual smile. I returned it automatically. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. I told my lawyer I needed to remove myself from every shared financial connection with my parents' beneficiary designations, joint accounts, emergency contacts. He studied me for a moment, then nodded and began drafting the documents. "You're certain?" he asked. "Completely," I said. When I reached the bank later that day, the teller behind the counter looked surprised as I handed over the paperwork to freeze the joint account. $70,000 sat in it, money I'd set aside for family emergencies, not realizing I'd someday define the word differently. The teller asked for a reason. "Suspected misuse," I replied quietly. It was easier than explaining the truth. By the time I returned to my hotel, the city lights had started to blink on. I closed the curtains, turned off the television, and sat in the dimness. My phone began to buzz near midnight. First my father's number, then Lily's, then both again, their names lighting up and vanishing in rhythm. I didn't answer. When the messages started coming through, I read them once and deleted them. They weren't apologies, only demands. My father ordered me to unfreeze the account immediately, insisting the wedding deposit was due. Lily accused me of sabotaging her big day. Every word confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't a person to them anymore. I was a function that had stopped working. Around 3 a.m, sleep finally overtook me. It didn't last long. I woke with my heart pounding, gasping for air that wouldn't fill my lungs. Panic spread through my chest like cold water. I stumbled to the window, pulled the curtains aside, and pressed my palm against the glass until I could feel the night air cooling the surface. It was the first time in my life I realized I was truly alone. The next 3 days blurred together. I moved through hotel corridors down to the lobby for food I couldn't eat back up again to stare at the same 4 walls. By the 4th day, I'd lost track of time. When Carla called to say a buyer was ready to sign, I told her to proceed. 2 weeks to close, she said, her voice bright with efficiency. "That works," I replied. The words felt strange in my mouth, as though they belonged to someone else. That afternoon, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed hollowed out, dark circles, hair pulled into a careless knot, shoulders drawn tight. I stared until I couldn't anymore. "You need to move," I whispered. My reflection didn't argue. I searched online for apartments and found one across town, a small place with bare white walls and windows that faced east. When I met the leasing agent later that evening, she spoke cheerfully about amenities, gym access, modern kitchen, quiet neighbors. I signed the lease without hesitation. I didn't care about any of it. I just needed somewhere that wasn't full of ghosts. Moving was simple. I didn't own much that mattered anymore. A few suitcases, a box of books, some framed certificates from work. I left everything else for the movers to sell or discard. When I walked into my new apartment for the first time, the emptiness was startling. It smelled faintly of fresh paint and nothing else. I set my purse on the counter and listened to the hollow echo of my own footsteps. It was strange, but the silence here felt different, less like abandonment, more like possibility. That night, exhaustion finally broke through. I sat on the floor beside the window and cried until my throat ached. They weren't polite tears. They were the kind that came from deep inside, the kind that had waited years for permission. I cried for the girl who'd braided her sister's hair, for the young woman who'd built her parents' trust fund with her own paycheck, for the daughter who'd been told to disappear. When the sobs finally slowed, the quiet that followed was steady and clean, like the air after a storm. Morning brought a kind of resolve I hadn't felt in months. I made coffee on the tiny kitchen counter and drank it while standing barefoot by the window, watching sunlight climb the walls. The thought came suddenly, as clear as the sound of the percolator. If they had chosen to erase me, I had the right to write what came next. At work, I asked my supervisor Thomas for a meeting. His office smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, a comforting mix. "I'd like to request a transfer," I said, keeping my tone even. "Preferably to another branch. Somewhere I can start fresh." He studied me for a moment. Thomas was not a man who wasted sympathy, but he had always valued my diligence. "Chicago's expanding," he said finally. "There's a management opening. It's a step up." I nodded. "I'll take it." By Friday, the transfer was approved. I packed my things that evening, placing files into a cardboard box, taping over the company logo when I left. The city outside the office windows was gold, with sunset traffic humming below. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. A week later, I was on the road north. The drive took 8 hours, long enough to let my thoughts unspool. The highway stretched like a thin gray ribbon across fields, just beginning to green for spring. I stopped at a rest area somewhere in Indiana, bought a sandwich I barely tasted, and watched a family at the next table sharing fries. Their laughter drifted across the tables like music from another time. It didn't hurt to watch. It simply reminded me of what I no longer expected. Chicago rose on the horizon as evening settled. The skyline shimmered in the distance, tall and certain. My new apartment was small but efficient, tucked above a cafe that smelled like roasted beans and vanilla syrup. The landlord, a kind man named Mr. Patel, handed me the keys with a gentle smile. "Fresh start?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. The next morning, I met my new supervisor, Sarah Michaels, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the river. She shook my hand firmly. "I've read your record," she said. "Impressive. But I'm more interested in what you want to build next." Her directness startled me. For years, my goals had revolved around other people's needs. "I don't know yet," I admitted. Sarah smiled. "Good. That means you're open." In the weeks that followed, I began to learn what it felt like to live without apology. My new team respected me. The work was demanding, but absorbing. I walked to the office each morning through the smell of bakeries and lake wind, and each evening I came home to a quiet apartment that answered only to me. The ache of loneliness didn't vanish, but it softened into something manageable, like an old injury that no longer dictated movement. Sometimes, though, the past found its way in. A wedding announcement appeared on social media, my sister's smiling face framed by lace and champagne flutes. I stared at it for a long moment, then closed the screen. I didn't attend. Instead, I mailed a small envelope with a short note, just 2 words. "Congratulations, Lily." Inside was a check enough to help, but not enough to bind. I never received a reply. Life began to form new patterns. On Saturdays, I walked the lakeshore trail, watching runners move in rhythm with the water's edge. I started joining them first for a mile, then 2. Each step loosened something inside me. On Sundays, I cooked simple meals and played soft jazz from my grandmother's old playlist. Sometimes I would catch myself smiling for no reason at all. One evening, a familiar number appeared on my phone. For a long moment, I simply watched it ring. Then I let it go to voicemail. Later, curiosity made me listen. It was my mother's voice, soft but unsure. "I hope you're doing well," she said. "Your sister's married now. Everything turned out beautifully." A pause followed. "I suppose we all got what we wanted." Then the line clicked off. I deleted the message but found myself staring at the phone afterward. Maybe she believed what she said, that everyone had gotten what they wanted. Maybe she didn't know yet that peace doesn't come from pretending harm never happened. Outside, a train horn drifted across the city. I turned off the lights and stood by the window watching the faint reflection of my own face in the glass. I looked different, leaner perhaps, and older, but there was something else too. A steadiness, the kind that doesn't wait for approval. It would take months before I fully understood that what had begun as exile was slowly becoming freedom. But even then, standing in that dim apartment above the cafe, I could feel the first quiet edges of it forming. Somewhere beyond the glass, the lake shimmered under the streetlights. I watched until the water blurred into darkness, until the world settled into its late-night hum. Then I whispered to no one at all, just to the silence itself. "This isn't the end." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The days that followed settled into quiet rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and the sound of streetcars echoing across the river. I left early for work, walking through the gray light that rose over the bridges. The city had its own pulse, steady and impersonal, and for the first time in my life, that steadiness felt like safety. No one here knew my last name. No one expected anything of me beyond the work I did. At the office, Sarah had a way of drawing the best out of people. She never raised her voice, but her presence filled a room. When she spoke, you wanted to listen. During one of our early meetings, she asked where I saw myself in 5 years. The question lingered long after the meeting ended. For years, my goals had been shaped by someone else's expectations. Be dependable. Keep things together. Don't make trouble. Now the horizon stretched open wide and unfamiliar. I stayed late most evenings, not because I had to, but because the quiet of the office after everyone left helped me think. Sometimes I'd look out across the city lights, watching the trains trace thin lines through the dark. I'd imagine the lives unfolding in the windows below, families eating dinner, someone tuning a guitar, a woman folding laundry under the soft glow of a lamp. I told myself I was content just to watch, but I knew that wasn't entirely true. One Thursday after work, I met a few colleagues at a nearby restaurant. The laughter around the table came easily unforced. When one of the analysts, a man named Kevin, asked where I was from, I hesitated longer than I meant to. "A small suburb outside Nashville," I said, finally. He smiled. "Nice place." I gave a little shrug. "It used to be." That night, as I walked home under the amber streetlights, the weight of everything I'd lost pressed close again. It wasn't the house or the money or the shared memories that haunted me. It was the idea that love could vanish so cleanly, as if it had never existed at all. The following weekend, an unexpected message appeared in my inbox. It was from Olivia Chen, my college roommate, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd seen a post about my transfer on a professional site. "Chicago suits you," her message read. "Let's catch up if you're nearby." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Meeting someone from my past felt risky, but loneliness is persuasive. We agreed to meet at a small cafe by the lake the following Sunday. Olivia arrived exactly on time, wearing the same easy smile I remembered. Over coffee, conversation flowed the way it used to in our dorm days, books we'd read, jobs we'd loved, or outgrown the quiet details of adulthood. When I finally told her what had happened with my family, she didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her eyes steady on mine. When I finished, she said softly, "Amy, that wasn't family tension. That was emotional abuse." The word startled me. I'd never named it that way before. Abuse sounded too heavy, too final. But as she spoke about control, isolation, and conditional affection, something inside me began to settle. It was as if the scattered pieces of my story had found their corners at last. "Have you thought about therapy?" she asked. "Sometimes it helps to untangle what really happened." That night, her words kept replaying in my head. The next morning, I searched online and found a therapist nearby. Her name was Dr. Catherine Wilson, specializing in family trauma. By Tuesday, I was sitting in her softly lit office, surrounded by framed prints of ocean scenes and smooth stones arranged neatly on a table. In our first session, I told her everything. How my parents had turned their backs on me. How Lily had twisted truth into lies, how I had been told to disappear. She listened quietly, nodding from time to time. When I stopped talking, she said, "Families sometimes create scapegoats, Amy. They assign blame to one person so they don't have to face their own dysfunction. The more capable that person is, the more threatening she becomes." I let her words sink in. Scapegoat. Threatening. None of those things had ever been part of how I saw myself. I'd thought I was the dependable one, the helper. But as the weeks went by, I began to see the pattern clearly, how my success had been twisted into competition, how love had always been measured by usefulness. Dr. Wilson encouraged me to build new connections to form what she called chosen family. She said it would remind me that belonging doesn't have to come from blood. Following her advice, I joined a Saturday yoga class and a small neighborhood book club. The first few meetings felt awkward, like learning to speak a new language, but the faces became familiar, and the quiet nods of recognition each week began to matter more than I expected. Work kept growing busier. Under Sarah's mentorship, I learned to lead with calm authority. During a department meeting one afternoon, she stopped me mid-sentence. "Amy, you keep minimizing your achievements," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Modesty is fine. Disappearing is not." The room went still. I felt a blush creep up my neck, but something about her words landed deep. That evening, I walked home slower than usual, watching the sky shift from gold to gray. It occurred to me that for most of my life, I'd equated humility with safety, stay small, and no one will find fault. Now I began to understand that shrinking had never protected me. It had only made it easier for others to take what they wanted. 3 months after moving to Chicago, I received an envelope in the mail. The handwriting on the front stopped me cold. Lily's. Inside was an elegant wedding invitation wrapped in tissue paper. Tucked between the folds was a small note. "I know things are complicated, but it would mean a lot if you came. Love, Lily." I read it 3 times, trying to sense the truth beneath the words. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done, only a polite reach across the void. Still, I hesitated before deciding. Attending the wedding would mean returning to that world even briefly. Declining would mean letting go completely. In the end, I didn't go. Instead, I bought a plain envelope slipped inside a cashier's check for $10,000 and wrote a single line on the card, wishing you happiness. I mailed it without a return address. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was closure in the only form I could manage. Weeks passed without a response, which was answer enough. I later learned from a mutual friend that my absence had been explained as a work emergency. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or sigh. Perhaps that story suited them better than the truth. Life kept moving. I enrolled in an evening MBA program, partly for career advancement, partly for the sense of building something that was entirely my own. Weekends filled with long runs along the lake, the steady rhythm of my feet matching the waves. I began volunteering once a month at a women's shelter, teaching simple financial skills, budgeting credit, how to read a loan agreement. The gratitude in their faces felt different from anything I'd known before. It wasn't admiration or expectation. It was mutual respect. There were still hard nights. Sometimes I'd wake before dawn with my heart racing, the old panic flickering at the edges. When that happened, I'd make tea, sit by the window, and watch the first light spill across the water. The stillness reminded me that I had survived the worst and was still here. One evening in early winter, Sarah invited me to a small gathering at her apartment. Her home overlooked the river, warm light spilling from the windows onto the snow. Around her dining table sat a few co-workers, their laughter mingling with the music. At some point, Sarah raised a glass toward me. "To new beginnings," she said, "and to people who learn how to build life on their own terms." The words were simple, but they struck something deep inside me. As everyone clinked glasses, I felt the quiet realization settle in: this was what family could feel like. Not obligation, not comparison, just presence. Later that night, walking home through the cold, I thought about how far I'd come from that night in my parents' living room. The ache was still there, but softer now, no longer sharp enough to cut. Healing, I realize, doesn't arrive all at once. It grows quietly in the background until one day you notice you can breathe without pain. When I reached my apartment, snow was falling in slow spirals outside the window. I poured a glass of water, turned off the lights, and stood watching the city. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Somewhere in that quiet, a thought took shape, small at first, but clear enough to hold. I had spent years measuring my worth through the eyes of others. Now, I was beginning to see myself through my own. I left the window open a crack and let the cold air drift in. The city below murmured with distant traffic life moving on. I breathed it in, steady and deep, and knew that whatever came next, I was finally ready to face it on my terms. The news reached me on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. Olivia called while I was walking to work, her voice tight, the way people sound when they're not sure where to begin. "Amy, have you seen the headlines?" she asked. I hadn't. She paused, then said, "James's family business, it's all over the news. They're being investigated for tax fraud." The words stopped me mid-stride. A chill wind moved through the street, carrying the smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Bad," she said. "Federal charges. Their accounts are frozen. Your parents' names came up too. They invested heavily." When the call ended, I stood at the corner, traffic blurring past, feeling the world tilt a little. I walked the rest of the way to the office without noticing the lights changing. All morning, my mind circled the same question: what happens to people who build everything on someone else's illusion of wealth? That evening, I searched the news online. The screen filled with headlines, articles detailing how Edward Kingston had run an elaborate Ponzi scheme using new investors to pay old ones. James had been listed as vice president, fully complicit. My parents, the report said, were among the private investors who had poured in their savings. One photo showed my father leaving a courthouse. His suit rumpled his face, drawn in a way I'd never seen. My mother stood beside him, looking small, almost lost. I closed the laptop slowly, the glow of the screen fading from my hands. The feeling that settled wasn't triumph. It was quieter, heavier. They had chosen that world over me, and it was now collapsing around them. For a long time, I sat there in the half-dark, listening to the hum of the city outside. 2 weeks later, I ran into my mother by accident. It was a gray morning at the farmer's market, the kind of day when everything felt muted. I was reaching for peaches when someone bumped my arm. I looked up, and there she was. Her hair, once carefully styled, was streaked with gray. Her clothes were neat but plain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "Amy, I thought you moved away." "I did," I said quietly. "Just visiting a friend." We stood surrounded by the chatter of strangers and the smell of fruit. Her hand trembled on the basket she carried. "How are you?" she asked. "I'm well," I answered. She nodded, eyes darting to the ground. "That's good." "I'm glad." The silence that followed was full of things neither of us could say. Finally, I stepped back. "Take care of yourself," I said. She opened her mouth as if to reply, then closed it again. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. In the reflection of a glass window, I saw her standing alone by the stall's shoulders, bent forward, as if bracing against the wind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of her lingered, the fragility, the way she had looked at me, not with blame, but with something close to regret. Yet even in that moment, she hadn't asked where I lived or how to reach me. The distance between us was still deliberate, as though neither of us trusted the bridge to hold. Winter deepened. Work kept me busy, and Sarah's mentorship grounded me. Old ghosts have a way of finding cracks, she told me once, after noticing my distraction. Seal them with purpose. Don't let them drift back in. I tried to follow her advice, throwing myself into projects, into the steady comfort of routine. But one evening, Olivia called again. "Amy, there's more," she said. "Lily's getting divorced, James's assets are gone, and investigators found emails showing she knew about the family's finances. She's moved back in with your parents." I sank into a chair, the phone pressed to my ear. "And their house?" I asked. "Foreclosure notice has been filed," she said softly. "The bank's giving them a month." After we hung up, I sat in silence, the city sounds muffled by the window glass. Part of me wanted to feel pity. Another part felt only exhaustion. The world they'd chosen was unraveling thread by thread, and I could do nothing to stop it, or perhaps I simply didn't want to. 3 days later, a call came from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but instinct made me answer. "Amy." The voice said, hesitant but familiar. "It's Lily." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Hearing her name aloud felt like reopening a door I'd locked tight. Her words tumbled out quickly. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but everything's falling apart. I didn't know who else to call." I took a slow breath. "How did you get my number?" "Olivia's cousin," she admitted. "Please don't be angry with her." "What do you want, Lily?" I asked. "I need to explain," she said. "James used me. His family did. They knew the business was collapsing before the wedding. They thought being connected to our family would make them look legitimate. They told Dad that you were asking too many questions, that you'd ruin everything if you stayed involved." Her voice broke. "Dad believed them. He said cutting you off would protect the family. I should have stopped him, Amy, but I didn't. I was stupid, and I wanted their approval." I sat there listening to the faint crackle of the line. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because we're losing everything," she whispered. The bank's foreclosing. Dad can't find work. Mom's not well. We need help. A loan just enough to keep the house. I closed my eyes. The old reflex to rescue them stirred like an ache in my bones, but I knew what it would cost. I'll think about it, I said finally. I'll call you back. For a week, I lived in quiet conflict. At night, I turned over the question until it lost all shape. Dr. Wilson listened patiently during an emergency session. If you choose to help them, she said, do it in a way that honors your boundaries. Not to earn forgiveness. Not to erase the past. Sarah was less gentle. They made their bed, Amy. Don't crawl back into it to keep them warm. Olivia. Ever the balance said simply, do what lets you sleep at night. In the end, I decided to see them face to face. The drive back to my hometown felt both familiar and foreign. The highway curved through the same fields I'd once known, but everything looked smaller. When I turned onto my parents' street, the house appeared weathered. The lawn, overgrown, shutters faded. I parked in the driveway and sat for a long moment, watching the curtains stir in the front window. My father opened the door. He looked older. His shoulders rounded, his hair fully gray. You came? He said quietly. I nodded. Let's talk inside. The living room smelled faintly of dust and coffee. My mother sat on the sofa, hands clasped around a tissue. Lily stood near the window, her face drawn but open. No one seemed to know where to begin. Finally, I said, tell me everything. They did. My father spoke first, voice rough. The business had been failing long before the wedding. Edward Kingston promised a solution, easy investments, high returns. When I'd asked questions at that first dinner, he'd grown wary. He told me you were suspicious, my father said, staring at the floor. He said, if we wanted his trust, we'd have to show loyalty. I convinced myself cutting you out was temporary. My mother's voice trembled. We thought we were protecting the family. We were wrong. So wrong. Lily wiped her eyes. After you left, they used the wedding to lure more investors. When the investigation began, James filed for divorce and disappeared. We lost everything. The room went quiet, except for the faint ticking of the old wall clock. I looked at them, 3 people who had once been my whole world, now sitting in the wreckage of their own choices. What do you need? I asked. $75,000, my father said, to stop the foreclosure. I know it's too much to ask, but I raised a hand gently. I'm not giving you money. Their faces fell. But I'll help you find someone who can guide you. I'll connect you with the financial advisor and a lawyer I trust. They'll negotiate with the bank, maybe arrange a short sale or a new loan. Beyond that, it's up to you. My mother looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. You'd still do that for us. I'll help, I said softly, but not at the cost of losing myself again. For the first time, my father didn't argue. He just nodded, his eyes wet. Thank you, he said, for even coming. Over the next month, I kept my promise. I connected them with professionals, reviewed documents when asked, and nothing more. They eventually sold the house and moved into a small rental across town. My father found work as a bookkeeper. Lily enrolled in community college to study social work. Our calls remained cautious, our boundaries clear. 6 months later, they came to visit me in Chicago. Standing in my doorway, they looked uncertain, like guests in a museum. I showed them around my townhouse, the plants on the windowsill, the framed prints I'd chosen myself. When they left, my mother hugged me for the first time in years. You built something beautiful, she whispered. That evening, as the door closed behind them, I felt a quiet release. The anger that had once defined me had faded into something gentler, a kind of steady acceptance. Weeks later, Lily and I sat on my patio, watching the sun lower over the city. "I used to hate how capable you were," she said, after a long silence. "I thought it made me small. Now I see it made you free." I didn't answer right away. The light caught her face, and for the first time in years, I recognized the sister I'd once known. "We all learn differently," I said. She smiled faintly. "I'm trying to learn from you now." The sky shifted from gold to blue. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed, the sound carried by the wind. I sat back in my chair and let the moment settle. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close, like the hush that follows a storm when the air is clear and the ground finally begins to breathe again. The morning after Lily's visit, I woke before the alarm. Pale light spilled across the bedroom wall, soft and deliberate. Outside, the city was still half asleep, just the whisper of traffic, a few early footsteps on the sidewalk below. The peace in that hour felt earned, like air cleared after a long storm. For the first time in years, there was no guilt waiting to greet me. Only quiet. I brewed coffee and stood by the window while the aroma filled the kitchen. The streets were slick from overnight rain, silver gray under the rising sun. I thought of all the mornings I'd once spent running from silence, filling it with work errands or noise, so I wouldn't have to hear myself think. Now silence felt like company. In the weeks that followed, I moved through my life with an ease I hadn't known before. Work still kept me busy, but I carried it differently. My voice no longer shook in meetings. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. Sarah noticed it before I did. One afternoon, after a presentation, she leaned against my office door and smiled. "You finally believe you belong here," she said. "I think I do," I answered, and she nodded, as though that was all she'd been waiting to hear. Outside the office, small things began to bloom again. On Saturdays, Lily and I met for coffee in the park near the river. We talked carefully at first about schoolwork, the things that felt safe. Each time we met, her posture relaxed a little more. She had taken a part-time job at the local clinic while finishing her classes. "It feels good to help people," she said one morning, stirring sugar into her cup. "I understand now why you always worked so hard." I smiled. "Helping is easier when it doesn't cost you yourself," I said. She nodded, eyes thoughtful. There was no need to rehash the past. The way we spoke to each other now was proof of how far we'd both come. My parents stayed in Tennessee, quietly rebuilding their lives. They sent cards now and then, birthdays, holidays, the occasional handwritten note that carried more humility than words. My father had started volunteering at a community center, helping small businesses with their books. My mother joined a church choir again. Her voice, she said, not as strong as before, but steadier. We spoke on the phone once a month, brief and gentle conversations that never pressed for more. Boundaries that had once felt like walls now felt like windows open enough for light strong enough to stand. In March, Dr. Wilson suggested ending therapy. "You've built your toolkit," she said. "You know how to care for your peace now." She asked what I planned to do next. I told her I'd been thinking of something new, maybe starting a small mentorship program for women entering finance. "I want to help them see their value before someone else defines it for them," I said. Dr. Wilson smiled. "That sounds like healing turned outward," she said. "That's how it lasts." So I did. With Sarah's help, I launched Foundations Forward, a mentorship group that met once a month at our office. 10 women joined that first session, bright, eager faces at the start of their careers. I watched them take notes, share worries, trade laughter. In their voices, I heard echoes of my younger self, and for the first time, I felt gratitude for every scar that had brought me here. That spring, Lily came to visit Chicago. She arrived with a small suitcase and a nervous smile. We walked through the city by the lake, through the art museum along the quiet paths where the air smelled faintly of tulips. That evening over dinner, she reached into her bag and handed me a folded envelope. "I found this while packing," she said softly. "It's from Grandma." I opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter written years earlier, addressed to both of us. In her steady cursive, Grandma had written about kindness, about how family is something you protect, not possess. At the bottom, a single line stood out. "When love becomes a transaction, stop the trade and start the truth." We sat in silence, letting the words sink in. "I wish we'd known that sooner," Lily said. "Maybe we weren't ready," I replied. Later that night, we stood on my balcony, watching the lights ripple across the river. The breeze was cool, carrying the faint hum of traffic. "Do you think things will ever feel normal again?" she asked. "Maybe not the old normal," I said, "but something better, something real." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a moment, everything felt quietly whole. When summer arrived, I took a week off work and drove north to a small cabin near Lake Superior. The road wound through endless trees, their leaves alive with wind. Each mile farther from the city felt like an unburdening. The cabin was simple pine floors, a single porch light, and a view of water that shimmered like glass. I spent mornings walking along the shore, afternoons reading on the porch, evenings watching the sun dissolve into gold. One night, as the sky deepened into violet, I lit a candle on the railing and listened to the steady rhythm of waves. For years, I had chased peace as if it were something outside myself, something earned, achieved, proven. But standing there in the quiet, I realized peace wasn't a prize. It was a practice. It was the decision to stop fighting with ghosts and start living with grace. On my last morning there, I woke to the sound of rain on the roof. The air smelled of cedar and earth. I brewed coffee, opened the door, and watched the lake blur under the soft downpour. In that moment, I thought of the road that had brought me here, the goodbyes that felt like endings but were really beginnings in disguise. When I returned to Chicago, life resumed its rhythm, but I carried the stillness with me. My apartment felt lighter, the walls warm with morning light. I'd framed Grandma's letter and hung it above my desk. Beneath it, I placed a small vase of white tulips, fresh, fragile, enduring. Months passed. One evening in early fall, I hosted a dinner for my mentorship group. We filled the room with laughter, shared food, and quiet pride. At the end of the night, Sarah raised her glass again, just as she had months before. "To growth," she said. "To choosing peace without permission." I caught my reflection in the window, older, softer, unafraid. The woman staring back wasn't waiting for anyone to name her worth. She already knew. After everyone left, I stepped out onto the balcony. The city lights shimmered against the dark river, the same view that had once felt lonely, but now felt like home. I thought of my family scattered across different places, yet still tied by something quieter than obligation, by the fragile thread of understanding. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the night. Somewhere, a train passed in the distance, its low whistle fading like a memory finally at rest. Peace doesn't arrive with grand gestures. It slips in quietly through forgiveness given without expectation, through mornings that begin without dread, through the soft certainty that you've survived and become whole. Some wounds don't fade because we forgive. They fade because we finally let go. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know. And if you've ever had to rebuild your peace from the ground up, share your story below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength and second chances. And wherever you are tonight, I hope your horizon is quiet too.